Greetings friends and welcome to the Old World. I'm Lorcan and this is Only War. In this, the third episode in the history of the Old World, we will cover a period of time that would shape the entire future of all races. We will focus on two titanic conflicts. One, a terrible civil war as an usurper to an ancient kingdom caused the very gods to abandon a blessed people. And the other, the conclusion of the bitter conflict between two former allies that would leave both races with wounds that would never heal. Before we begin, a huge thanks to the supporters on Patreon, who for as little as $2 a month are helping build the channel towards the goal of more regular uploads in the future. The Patreon and other ways you can support Only War either directly or through using my affiliate links are in the description. If you're new here, thank you for joining us, and I hope I earn your subscription today. The previous two episodes in the timeline of the Old World will be linked in the comments. We begin this chapter in 1750 before the birth of Sigmar. The War of the Beard between the kingdoms of the Dwarves and the High Elves has already raged across the Old World for centuries, but we will focus first on the events in the south. The rise of the great necromancer, and his reign of terror over Nehekara. Barely a month had passed since Nagash had performed the ritual at the Black Pyramid that cast a shadow over Nehekara and killed the majority of the priests and acolytes of the ancient Blessed Lands. This fateful act finally caused the majority of the priest kings of the other great cities to rebel against the Dark Lord of Khemri's reign of terror and raise arms against him. Nagash quickly gathered an army of mostly mortal followers and marched out with little thought or care for the welfare of his troops into the desert to the oasis of Zedri, where he was met in battle by an army of Amenhotep, priest king of Kar-Shabar, who was the first to muster his forces and march on the living city to challenge Nagash. The men of Kar-Shabar were powerfully built, their army the bronze host disciplined and blessed by the gods. The citizens of the living city had suffered years of famine and uncaring rule, and Nagash had driven his forces to exhaustion, barely affording them sleep, nourishment, or water as they were force-marched across the shifting sands. Nagash also showed little signs of tactical acumen in the first stages of the battle, his forces being thrown against the superior numbers of the Kar-Shabar, with little thought of their survival, until they were driven back by Amenhotep's men. But just as victory appeared in his grasp, and his infantry forces fully committed, the priest king would look on in horror as Nagash sprang his trap and unleashed potent black magic. A line of black pavilions had been erected along the low ridgeline where the Khemrian forces had initially mustered. From these, priests of the mortuary cult brought forth 8 heavy jars, each vessel sealed with a thick band of wax, engraved with intricate glyphs. When the signal was given, the seals were broken, and whirling cyclones of dust above them darkened to thick, glossy black. An awful, whirring drone vibrated across the battlefield, causing men to drop their weapons clutching their ears, and horses to rear in terror as ebon pillars rose from the jars and roiling darkness spread across the sky. The dark magic that was unleashed would send the bronze host into disarray, not only because of the unnatural keening wail, but as they would be assailed by the reanimated corpses of both the usurper's soldiers and their own fallen. Amenhotep realized in horror that Nagash's unholy powers were far greater than he imagined, and ordered a retreat. From the Black Pavilion's Arkan the Black, vizier to Nagash directed the next phase of their counterattack, ordering the use of an ancient war device recently brought back into use by Nagash, the Screaming Skull catapult. Their grisly missiles exploded amongst friend and foe, but the bronze host was not immune to their unholy shrieks as the forces of Nagash were, and attacked by enemies both living and dead on all sides, their orderly retreat disintegrated into a frenzied rout that would push them back into the reanimated corpses of those they had already slain. Arkhan would commit to battle personally at the head of the Kemrian cavalry, and would be met by a desperate counterattack by heavy chariots of the Bronze Host, led by Susep the Lion, one of the greatest living warriors in all of Nehekara. The priests of Kar-Shabar's army tried to combat the necromancy of Nagash, but they were finding the power unleashed by the usurper well beyond anything they had encountered. But Akmenhotep got some measure of respite when their allies, the famed horsemen from Bagar, arrived to reinforce his army. As Arkhan the Black entered a deadly duel with Susep on the battlefield, the incantations of the priests began to pierce the veil of dark magics unleashed by the usurper's followers, and Nagash himself was forced to act. The priest king of Kemri revealed the blasphemy he had committed at the Black Pyramid, bringing forth Nepharem, the daughter of the sun, the covenant with the gods made flesh, but now a tortured undead being, bound completely to Nagash's will. Her plight and the portents it brought would have a devastating effect on the priests, as they were unable to call upon their gods in her presence, and those warriors further empowered by the ancient Nehekaran deities were overcome with weakness. Suseb would fall to Arkhan in their duel, and Akmenhotep was forced to retreat from the field of battle with what few troops he could. Nagash would choose not to pursue, as he knew the armies of the kings of Raistra and Libarus were already marching on Kemri. The Raistra and Libyrus combined armies would defeat Nagash's allies from Qatar at the Gates of Dawn and go on to occupy Qatar itself. The way to Kemri was now open to them. Despite his victory at Zedri, the skilled horsemen of Bagar would continue to harry Nagash's tattered army as it made its way back to Kemri. After their most vicious assault, Nagash would task Arkhan with taking Bagar in 5 days, while he would return to Kemri and summon his other allies from Numas and Zandri for a council of war. Using all his powers of necromancy, Arkhan would defeat the army of Prince Shahid ben Alcazar on the outskirts of Bagar city, despite the valiant efforts of his desert horsemen. The prince would suffer in an attempt to save his people, but when they were gathered outside the city, Arkhan would slay the prince and all the members of the noble households, and send the enslaved people of Bagar into the desert in chains. On the same day Arkhan took Bagar, the kings of Numas and Zandri would arrive in Kemri for an audience with Nagash, where they informed him that they would need time to ready their armies before they could support Kemri. Unable to call on his allies, Nagash enacted a ritual at the Black Pyramid that saw blood rain fall on the occupied city of Qatar. This terrible rain caused the occupying troops and the general populace to swiftly sicken and die. The plague unleashed by Nagash was like no other ever encountered in the Blessed Land. It caused man and beast to descend into a maddening fever, and within a week the city was consumed in an orgy of bloodshed and violence. With both sides now needing to rebuild their devastated forces, a stalemate was reached that would last 4 years, while the fate of the Blessed Land hung in the balance. Nagash would remain in Kemri following his unleashing of the plague on Qatar, and his allies would also raise their armies as he had instructed. The priest kings of Raistra and Libarus would need to pass through the Valley of Kings before Nagash could retake the Gates of Dawn. To do this, the bronze host of Kar-Shabar would aim to draw Nagash's forces away by attacking Bel Aliad on the far side of the Great Desert, using secret paths known to the few refugees that had arrived from Bagar. The majority of the citizens of Bagar had been enslaved by Arkhan the Black and were put to work constructing his Black Tower on the edge of the Great Desert. Within 3 years all were dead, but Arkhan's skill in necromancy meant their toil did not end when they perished. Arkhan had hoped the distance between Khemri and the Black Tower would mean Nagash would teach him the secret of the elixir, but Nagash would not relinquish the hold he had over his most powerful servants. Nagash would inform Arkhan of the movements of their enemies, and order the Vizier to take his horsemen and ride for Bel Aliad, the city of spices, to once again face the Bronze host who this time had a traitor in their midst. The army of Amenhotep of Kashgar would draw out the city companies of Bel Aliad and their mercenary forces onto the field of battle, on an open rocky plain, and despite facing superior numbers, the martial prowess of the Bronze host and the tactical acumen of its king saw them repel many desperate charges from the forces of the City of Spices. Finally, the chariots and horses of Bel Aliad would overextend, and Amenhotep would lead a countercharge directly into them, challenging the prince of the city to personal combat and besting him with ease, accepting his surrender and that of his men. Unfortunately, the honourable end to the battle the king of Kashgar sought was swiftly dashed when he discovered his Bagharite guides had taken their vengeance out on the citizens of Bel Aliad, while the two forces had been locked in battle. But this victory was short-lived, as Arkhan the Black, who had not revealed his presence during the previous battle, raised the dead of the City of Spices and forced the Bronze host to abandon Bel Aliad to its fate, as the undead host slaughtered every living thing in the city. Amenhotep would flee into the desert, marching the remains of his army day and night to stay ahead of the dead, while being harried by skeletal cavalry. They were only saved by reaching a series of Bagharite supply caches hidden along the route, but even these provided meagre pickings for the starving warriors. Worse came as further caches turned out to be empty, and the force dwindled through ambushes and starvation. The remaining Bagharites fled with their horses, and without their guides the tattered remnants of the Bronze host was forced to march east, with little hopes of making it through the Great Desert. The remaining nobles would finally rise up against Amenhotep in desperation, believing their king had gone mad, and their only hope of survival was to treat with Nagash. Hisushabti saw off the rebelling nobles, but it was his own brother, the Grand Hierophant Memnet, who would be revealed as the traitor in his midst, ending the priest-king of Kashgar's reign with a knife in the back. Memnet's reward would be the gift of immortality granted by Nagash's elixir of life. The combined armies of Raestra and Lybaris defeated a vanguard force of Nagash's allies near the springs of eternal life on the western trade road leading to the living city, but the larger host of the usurper blocked their access to the life-giving waters of the oasis. The heavy infantry of the Raestrans, along with their lizard men conscripts, and the light infantry of the Libarans, pushed hard into the centre of Nagash's main force, causing him to commit his reserves to shore up his faltering battle line. The Libaran scholar priests then unleashed 6 massive hero titan constructs into the exposed left flank of the usurper's host, supported by more lizardmen auxiliaries that quickly sent the Khemrian infantry into disarray. This was compounded by an ambush by the other Libaran constructs, huge tomb scorpions that exploded from the sands, and the entire left flank collapsed. The Screaming Skull catapults now came into play, their enchanted flaming munitions proving particularly effective against the steam-powered wood and bronze hero titans, leaving only 2 standing. But even without the gigantic constructs, the left flank disintegrated. Nagash was forced to commit the last of his forces, the heavy cavalry of Numas, to try to halt the advance, and although they had initial success, a countercharge by the Libaran and Raestrian heavy cavalry and the Raestrian chariot, supported by Libaran skyboats that targeted the catapults, finally caused the usurper's army to break and fall back to the mist-shrouded oasis behind them. Believing themselves beyond attack, the skyboats carrying the kings of the allied force pushed on to the Fountains of Eternal Life to assess the task ahead, but they would be denied the life-giving water their army desperately needed. Nagash had desecrated the sacred oasis with the corpses of the dead, and his forces were rapidly reforming, now bolstered by his immortals and their companies of swordsmen. Nagash also unleashed sorcerous swarms of insects that attacked the crews and structures of the skyboats, causing them to plummet to the earth. Miraculously, the two kings survived the destruction of the skyboats and were able to retreat back to the lines of their advancing light cavalry before Nagash's host could reach them. With the oasis polluted, their only option to retreat back to the walled city of Qatar, with Nagash following in pursuit. It would take 3 grueling weeks for Priest King Rak-Am-Hotep to lead the Raystrian and Libaran survivors to the outskirts of Qatar, losing all their lizardmen auxiliaries on the way due to thirst, and their remaining war machines when they had exhausted the energies that powered them. Nagash's host shadowed them all the way, but showed no signs of attacking in a meaningful manner. This was because Nagash's plan was to send Arkan, who he had recalled from the victory over the Bronze Host, ahead to raise the dead of the White City to overwhelm Qatar's garrison and catch the allied army between the city walls and his host. Arkan would raise 30,000 dead from their tombs in the White City's necropolis, and by dawn none of the city's defenders would be alive. The Eastern Allied army would reach the apparent sanctuary of the walls only for its now undead defenders to fire upon them mercilessly. The King of Raistra initially despaired, but knowing his weakened army could not retake the city, and with Nagash's host threatening to encircle them, he was roused to the only course of action he thought would save his men, to march past Qatar and through the Valley of Kings to the holy city of Marak at the other end. Arkham would send all the dead of Qatar against the Eastern King's army, but with Rak-Am-Hotep's indomitable presence galvanizing their resolve, his beleaguered troops weathered the attacks and advanced around the perimeter of the city. The King of Raistra encouraged his men through the rain of arrows from Arkan's skeletal archers, and then led the rearguard personally as they finally repulsed the last of the undead. By coming in daylight, they had avoided the worst attentions of Arkan and the Immortals, who could not take the field directly. But just as his men began to celebrate the end of their ordeal and turned to salute their king, they found his chariot empty. Rak-Am-Hotep, the great warrior king of Raistra and hero of Nehekhara, had fallen, pierced through the throat by one of the last arrows fired from the city walls. Around 5,000 of the Eastern Army's troops were slain, but many more got past into the Valley of Kings, and the Libarians were able to collapse the Gates of Dawn behind them, greatly slowing Nagash's pursuing host. Nagash was greatly displeased and blamed Arkan personally for the escape of his foes. In punishment, he unleashed a swarm of tomb beetles that stripped Arkan's flesh down to the bone for over an hour. But the elixir of life meant he would not perish, and the vizier would have to endure the pain of Nagash's punishment. The Undying King would use the elixir to heal Arkan after his ordeal, and inform him and the other immortals and his allied kings that he would march their army on the seat of the Hierarchic Council at Marak. Arkan would be forbidden from wearing his sword and armor, and even denied a horse to further humiliate him. The armies of the East at last had some good fortune, finding the fortified Gates of Dawn unoccupied and well stocked with provisions. More than that, Hekmenutep, the priest king of Libarus, who was left clinging to life after his injuries following the skyboat crash, had enough strength to board his chariot and be seen by the allied army when his fever finally broke. Their morale was further bolstered when news spread that King Rak-Am-Hotep of Raistra had survived the arrow wound to his neck, the deadly shaft missing all his major arteries. The destruction of the Gates of Dawn gave the Eastern Allies 2 days' head start along the Valley of Kings, but Nagash's host were unrelenting, and soon their rearguard was in constant skirmishes with Nagash's scouts, but the terrain prevented them being overrun, and in 2 weeks they reached the Gates of Dusk. There they were met by a delegation from Marak, including priestesses of Asalf, who were able to heal the King of Raistra, but their instructions to him were dire. They advised him not to attempt to defend the Gates of Dusk, nor the City of Hope, but instead return to their own cities and allow Nagash to siege the Holy City. They hoped their wards and defences could hold long enough that the Eastern Kings could rebuild their armies and come to their salvation. While Merak had no standing army, it was defended not only by powerful wards, desert spirits, and the Ushabti that guarded the temples, but also by massive sphinxes that tore apart the bone giant constructs Nagash had sent forth to breach the gates and decimated his advancing cavalry. Even the corrupted power of Nepharem was unable to breach the city's powerful wards in the first onslaught. For 4 years, Nagash and his generals tried every conceivable tactic to overcome Merak's defences, all to no avail, and the plain outside the city became a vast field of bones. The Undying King's forces were dwindling, and even the stored energies of the Black Pyramid were becoming depleted. The Holy City held long enough for the eastern kingdoms of Rystra and Lybaros to raise new armies, even if many of their conscripts were grizzled old men or untested youths. The great kings of those 2 cities now had their forces mustered and hidden in the hills southeast of Merak, and awaited the order to attack. They were not the only force to approach the Holy City, as Lama-Shazar, the priest-king of Lamia, finally appeared to take a side for the first time in the 10-year conflict. To the despair of the city, it appeared the far eastern kingdom was lending its strength to Nagash. Lama-Shazar's offer was plain. He would aid Nagash and deliver Merak to him, in exchange for the secrets of the elixir of life. The young king of Lamia appeared to have the upper hand in the negotiations with Nagash, but at that moment word of a messenger from the Hierarchic Council arrived, and the Undying King broke off the negotiation. The emissary for the Holy City would inadvertently give away the knowledge that Nagash had in his grasp not only the ability to block the power of the old gods, but to control it himself. The hidden armies of Rystra and Lybaros were unfortunately discovered on the eve of their planned attack, and when they swept from their position, instead of scattering an unsuspecting enemy, they were met by an organized force of Numasti horsemen, and Nagash's host quickly assembled into 2 forces, one ready to support the Numasti against the eastern armies, and the other led by Nagash, and bearing the sarcophagus of Nepharem, advanced once more on Merak. Nagash forced Nepharem physically forwards into the wards surrounding the Holy City. The fiery rocks that had fallen on the attackers now broke apart before Nagash's queen, and the mighty sphinxes cowered away from Nepharem's tortured steps, as in her wake Nagash and his forces pushed on towards the city walls. The magical wards began to shatter, and heat built to the point where the very air seemed to glow, and then at last the pressure that was building was released, and a deafening silence fell across the field of bones. Nepharem was gone. The sphinxes turned to ribbons of smoke before being scattered by the wind, and darkness fell on Merak, the city of the gods. Nagash declared triumphantly that the age of gods was at an end, as he whirled his forces onwards towards the city. While he did so, he reached out to Arkan the Black and ordered his disgraced vizier to instruct the Xandrian contingent of his army to attack the Lamian force that had attempted to bargain with him before his final fateful push on the Holy City. With the final destruction of Nepharem, the daughter of the sun, the ancient covenant between Nehekara and the gods was broken forever. It could be felt all across Nehekara as the power of the gods receded from the blessed land. Nagash's bone giants soon smashed the gates of Merak, and although the city's Ushabti suffered greatly from the withdrawal of their gods, they still felled all of Nagash's giants and 15,000 skeletal warriors before the last of their numbers succumbed. But Nagash could still march on the palace of the gods with thousands more undead at his back. On the battlefield to the southeast, the armies of the eastern allies met the undead host under the command of Nagash's immortals, in what seemed like a final desperate stand. But unbeknownst to Nagash's pale-skinned generals, The twin kings of Numas had finally broken from their allegiance with Nagash, and their cavalry turned their charge into the unprepared flank of the undead host. At the same time, the allied cavalries of Raestra and Libera swept into the rear of the exposed skeletal infantry. With his immortals slain or in a desperate fight for their own survival, Nagash was forced to halt his advance on the Palace of the Gods and focus his attention on commanding the battle line outside the city. He used the incantation of summoning to raise Merak's dead and moved to rally his forces. However, the Numasti were not the only ones to turn against Nagash. Arkan had not ordered the Xandrian forces to attack the Lamian army. Instead, he had informed them of Nagash's plan, and the two mortal forces had turned on the great necromancer, the Xandrians attacking his encampment and destroying his Screaming Skull catapults, while the Lamians formed up and advanced south on Nagash's host. Even for all his great power, controlling such a large force and maintaining the mantle of shadows over the battlefield was quickly draining Nagash's magical reserves, and left him little power to invest in destructive battlefield spells. He saw the approaching Lamians threatening to pen in his army, and was forced to divert his attention their way. What Nagash did not know was the power of the 2,000 Lamian elite dragon men, who wielded projectile weapons that utilized the black powder made by the alchemists of Cathay. In a single volley, not only was Nagash's tomb guard reduced to a quarter of their original number, and a third of the rest of his companies failed, but even Nagash himself was wounded. Nagash's reserves were shattered by their devastating volleys, and rumors spread that Nagash himself had been slain. The remaining immortals fled, desperately breaking free of the encircling army of the allied priest kings and sacrificing much of their forces to do so. By the time they made it to the Valley of the Kings, the terrible army of the usurper had been mostly destroyed, but the bodies of neither Nagash nor Arkan the Black were found. 2 months after the Battle of Merak in 1740 before Sigmar, the force now known as the Army of Seven Kings arrived at Khemri, finding the city mostly deserted, the usurper's last remaining troops defending the Black Pyramid itself. Once the last of these undead minions was destroyed, hunting parties were sent into the Black Pyramid itself, and one by one, the immortals that had sought refuge there were dragged out into the light, to burn in the harsh sun before being decapitated. The Seven Kings themselves would enter the pyramid once Nagash's crypt beneath the ritual chamber was discovered. There they found his intricately carved marble sarcophagus, but as they heaved upon the casket's lid, a swarm of locusts and beetles poured out, filling the chamber with deafening sound before racing away down the main passageway. Once the swarm of insects was gone, the sarcophagus of the undying king was found empty. While Nagash's reign of terror from usurping his brother through to his eventual defeat at the hands of the Seven Kings would take just over 200 years, a much longer war continued in the Old World. In 1974, before the rise of Sigmar, the Phoenix King of the Azur, Calador II, had slain Prince Snorri Halfhand, heir to High King Gotrek Starbreaker, at Angaz Baragdum. 6 years had passed since that battle, and Calador was reveling in the adulation of the citizens of Ulthuan as he proclaimed victory in the Old World, and proudly showed them the hand he had severed from Prince Snorri and taken as a trophy. Despite his popularity, he was still wary of the affection his younger brother Prince Imladric was held by the population for his own victories against the Dark Elves and in the colonies. While Imladric was no statesman, he was the most famed dragon rider of his age, and Calador was worried he could be used by others as a figurehead for their own political machinations. Calador would order his brother back to the Old World, and despite Imladric's protestations, he would not refuse his brother's command. He would travel atop his great dragon Droghane, along with 5 other dragon riders. The Council of 5 at Torilesi sought that Imladric would decide if they would allow the throngs to besiege them again, or meet them out in the field. However, despite the great power at his command, Imladric would hope to seek peace with the dwarfs rather than their destruction in the field. Tens of thousands of Dawi had gathered in throngs from all across the Karaz-Ankor. They were united in slow, cold fury, and the rock itself rang from their iron-shod treads. All were there to avenge the grudges committed against their people and their High King. Among their number was the army of Morgrim Bargrum, cousin to Snorri Halfhand, and the one they were already calling the Doom of the Elves. Imladric sought to speak with Morgrim, as the two had once counted each other as friends, with Imladric earning the respect of the dwarf and learning to speak his language. Imladric also returned to Morgrim the hand of Prince Snorri that his older brother Calador had taken after their duel. Once it was interred with the Gordars rites, alongside the prince's body, he would not be crippled in the afterlife. The Master of Dragons told Morgrim and his advisors of the Sundering and the betrayal of Malekith, one the Dawi once called friend. Imladric blamed the Druki for the first attacks on the dwarf trade caravans that then drew both sides into the conflict, one as the aggrieved and one as the mistaken aggressor. Unfortunately, any slim hopes of peace were dashed when word came of a dragon rider attack on warriors mustering from Carrick Varn, and Imladric did not know the perpetrator to be the Druki sorceress Drutheria, riding an enslaved black dragon. The Fourth Siege of Torilesi began. The devastating intervention of Imladric and his dragon riders would prove pivotal in the siege, forcing the resolute dwarves to withdraw, never breaking despite the horrific casualties the terrifying creatures caused amongst their ranks. Morgrim realized they could not hope to defeat the might of the combined flight of dragon riders. He came to the conclusion the grand host must be fractured into smaller armies and used to attack all over the elven colonies, forcing the Azur to stretch their forces and the dragons over multiple battle fronts. This would be the only way they could hope to win the war. Morgrim would march with a small group to the southern frontier elven fortress of Oragor, a settlement Imladric had helped raise personally, and would join up with a force about to besiege it led by Brunoth, king of Barakvar. At the siege of Oragor, Morgrim would defeat Imladric in single combat, when the dwarven forces managed to down his mighty dragon, the potent rune axe of Morgrim proving decisive when it shattered Imladric's sword before carving open his midriff. It was 1962 before Sigmar when Oragard had fallen with the death of Imladric, and the War of the Beard had become one of attrition as both sides engaged in raids and ambushes on exposed targets and vulnerable outposts. 25 years passed from the killing of Snorri Halfhand by Calador II, the High Elves unwilling to commit more of their strength to the Old World, while the threat from Nagaroth was ever present, and Gotrek Starbreaker unwilling to unleash the full might of the Karaz-Ankor either. Heroic victories were earned, and terrible atrocities were committed on both sides of the bitter conflict. By 1863, before Sigmar, the war came to Barakvar, with a massive fleet of Azur ships entering the Black Gulf, rendering all the Dawi's sea defences useless. The dwarf hold was not without its own ships, but the robust ironclads were often easily outmanoeuvred by the swift and agile Azur galleys, and soon the Black Gulf was firmly in Azur hands. With the land routes and even tunnels to Barakvar also controlled by the elves, King Brunoth was cut off and surrounded in his sea hold. With the failure of relief forces from Carrick Hirn and Carrick Eight Peaks to breach the High Elf siege, High King Gotrek Starbreaker assembled a truly united throng, drawn from all across the Karaz-Ankor, and deemed the time was right to take the field of battle personally once more. Some elements of the Azur force besieging Barakvar turned to the use of enchanted mearworm fangs to force the sea serpent to attack the citadels protecting the Dawi's seahold. The use of this magic put the remaining dragons supporting the Azur armies ill at ease, and soon they would elect to abandon the fight. High King Gotrek observed the dragons as they flew into the mists of the mountains to the north, and from the reports he received, Gotrek determined the Azur would make one final effort to take Barak Var quickly before the dwarf throngs that were kept at bay by the presence of the dragons could descend on their positions. The damage done to the sea fortress had been great, but with the dwarf armies converging on their positions, the High Elves were forced to break the siege of Barak Var. By 1812, before the coming of Sigmar, Phoenix King Calador II was growing tired of the failures of repeated generals he sent to oversee the campaign in the Old World. The dragons had not just abandoned the siege of Barak Var to return to Torilesi. They soon flew from that bastion too and returned to the mountains of Calador, effectively leaving the war entirely. One dragon, however, did remain in the Old World. Drukain, steed of Prince Imladric, had continued to hunt the Dawi alone, seeking revenge for the Master of Dragon's death. The same forbidden dark magics were then used to enslave a red dragon in an attack on Kazakh Crow, last bastion of the hill dwarfs in what would be recorded in the Great Book of Grudges as the Massacre of Moloch. After more than an hour of slaughter, the dragon would reach the core of Kazakh Crow and the treasure hall of Skarnag Grum, High King of the Hill Dwarfs, where it would incinerate the gold-maddened monarch. In 1753, the Dawi came in force to besiege Torilesi again, with High King Gotrek Starbreaker leading the attack once more. The High Elves now had 4 magically enslaved dragons around the colonies, and all were called to Torilesi, while at the same time, Thoriol, son of Imladric, would use the shared bond with his father to rouse Drukain from his lair. However, the High King had been deceptive, using decoys and other tactics to make his force at Torilesi seem much larger, while secretly sending Morgrim at the head of a much larger force to attack Athol Torian, as the Azur called the dragons back to Torilesi. By 1662 before Sigmar, only the mightiest of the elven citadels in the Old World remained intact. Refugees from Athol Torelian had made their way to Sith Rionask, a sprawling coastal settlement surrounded by some of the richest farmland in the Azur holdings. It was defended almost as fiercely as Torilesi, and it was also where Thoriel had taken flight on Drukain to vent his vengeance on the Dawi that had killed his father. The Dwarf Siege was relentless. Grapnels pulled down walls and catapults hurled their payloads into the city. Engineers from Barak Var unleashed a huge catapult that tore down the great dam the elves had built to contain and exploit the Anurian River that ran past their settlement. Sith Rionask was obliterated by the flood waters unleashed, and the dwarves took hammer and mattock to the ruins, tearing them down to their very foundations. By 1602 before Sigmar, only really Torilesi still remained of the once mighty elven colonies. High King Gotrek had allowed Torilesi to endure by his own decree, the attacks by his forces merely probing, designed to cover for assaults on other cities, or to prevent the Azur mounting a counter-offensive. But Gotrek also hoped that while Torilesi still stood, the Phoenix King Calador II would be drawn back to the Old World. During the later years of the War of the Beard, many Dawi who had suffered disgrace or carried guilt from past failures travelled to Carrick Cadrin, to the Shrine of Grimnir, and had taken what was now called the Slayer Oath, to wash away their shame by seeking a heroic death. Morgrim reluctantly allowed them a position on his battle line despite their unreliability, deeming they had suffered enough. Prince Thoriel would urge Drukain to confront Morgrim as both sought vengeance for the death of Imladric, but Thoriel would be wounded defeating Forek Grimbrock, the shaven ambassador who had since taken the Slayer Oath, and in protecting him Drukain would finally be slain by Morgrim. The Dawi known as Elf Doom ordered Thoriel's wounds to be tended, and him to be returned, now with his father's reforged sword, to the care of the Azur. Back in Ulthuan, Calador was coming under increasing political pressure. The commanders he had sent to the colonies had been chosen for their rank and position in the noble houses rather than their tactical capabilities. While this had meant his best generals had been available to be deployed against the threat from Nagaroth, It also meant he faced the ire of the noble houses when their favoured sons and daughters were recalled in disgrace after each chastening defeat to the Dawi. Now the Phoenix King deemed the threat of the Druchii to be all but eliminated, although Malekith himself was still to be brought to final judgment. He elected to finally commit more fully to salvaging what he could from the colonies, not only recalling his army from Nagaroth, but levying troops from Ulthuan as well. Calador was going to lead the forces himself, leaving Ulthuan in the hands of Caradriel, who would act as his steward in his stead. In his arrogance he vowed to wear the phoenix crown as he led his forces in battle, saying how else would the Dawi know they had the honour of dying to a king. By 1601 before Sigmar, the dwarf throng led by Morgrim and High King Gotrek breached the outer defences of Torilesi through cunning use of undermining and strategic placement of demolition charges. A dwarvish delegation under a flag of truce started to march out to the inner wall's great gates to offer the inhabitants terms of surrender, but found the defenders not cowed but celebrating. In Torilesi's darkest hour, the armies of Ulthuan had arrived at last. It had been nearly 4 centuries since the Phoenix King last set foot in the Old World, and the arrival of his reinforcing army spurred the dwarfs into one last attempt to secure footholds on the inner walls. Morgrim himself joined a contingent of hammerers from the stronghold of Ekrund in a desperate assault on the main gate. While the dwarf forces made progress, it was too little to counter the disciplined, rapid deployment of the Azure reinforcements arriving by sea, and reluctantly Morgrim gave the command to withdraw, and his troops marched away from the inner walls to set up a new perimeter, as the pennant of King Calador II was raised above Torilesi. High King Gotrek and most of the dwarves blamed Calador entirely for the ruinous war between their peoples. The shame of Forek and the shaven ambassadors, then the slaying and mutilation of Prince Snorri. These were the crimes of the Phoenix King, and they could not be forgiven. The High King vowed to lead his armies into battle once the fighting resumed. This reckoning would be a conflict of kings, Gotrek against Calador. With Calador taking much of Ulthuan's military strength to the Old World colonies, the Witch King of the Druchii Malekith at last revealed his hand. He had been feigning weakness while rebuilding his ships and armies. Now, with the defences of the Azure homeland severely undermanned, his fleet sailed out from the Sea of Chill to assault the kingdom he felt it was his right to rule. At Torilesi, High King Gotrek had now assembled a throng drawn from nearly all corners of the Karazhan Core. An army unlike anything seen since the days of High King Snorri Whitebeard. He made his demands for Were-Guild one final time, knowing the arrogant Calador would never accept the terms of reparation. Gotrek then surprised Calador by attacking at the end of the same day his demands were made. The 14th siege of Torilesi beginning as grudge throwers began to rain their heavy payloads down on the great towers and inner walls of the Azure settlement. The massive stone blocks engraved with runes to dispel any elvish defensive enchantments. The great gates of the inner walls were brought down by Rune Lord Morek, who sacrificed himself invoking the right to destroy an anvil of doom and unleashing the terrible power contained within. The resultant explosion reducing the mighty gates to splinters. With Morgrim leading the charge, the Dawi poured through the breach, and fought with no thought of the losses they suffered as the elves contested every street with bow and spear, while their griffins and eagles swooped down to tear at the resolute dwarfs with beak and talon. The banner of the Phoenix King would be raised in Torilesi's Founders Square, and here Calador would make his challenge to the leaders of the Dawi. Here was where he and his knights would stand and fight, supported by regiments of swordsmen and archers. The warriors of Morgrum Elgi Dum were the first to march out into the square. Calador ordered his knights to charge at the advancing dwarf lines, causing them to form a shield wall, and the two sides met in a horrendous clash of steel. Calador and Morgrim would engage in single combat, with the mounted Calador looking to have the better of the famed dwarf Thane, before he realised the Dawi had encircled his position, and the Hearth Guard of the High King pushed forward through the press of dwarf warriors. Carried aloft by his throne-bearers seated on the ancient throne of power, High King Gotrek Starbreaker challenged the Phoenix King. Both kings dismounted and readied themselves, Gotrek wielding the axe of Grimnir and Calador his blade Dawn-Killer. Calador had speed and finesse on his side, but the meteoric iron and runic wards of Gotrek's armor meant even a blade as powerful as Dawn-Killer found it hard to penetrate them. Gotrek brought all his rage to bear in his attacks with the axe of Grimnir, and while the Phoenix King could avoid most of the savage blows, when they did find their mark, they cut through his armor like parchment. Calador mocked Gotrek, and in his fury the Phoenix King seized on an opening to cut open Gotrek's hand, severing 2 fingers. But the wound did not stop Gotrek's attack, and his axe cleaved deep into the Phoenix King's knee. Calador was, for all his faults, a great swordsman, and even with this injury he was still able to strike another blow across the High King's helm and fend off Gotrek's next strike. But Gotrek would not be denied his vengeance. When Calador was unbalanced for just an instant, the axe of Grimnir slammed into Calador's side, cleaving his golden armor and breaking his ribs. Calador would finally yield and offer to withdraw his forces from the old world and pay full restitution, but with the memory of his slain son burning in his mind, Gotrek would hear none of Calador's pleas and brought the axe of Grimnir down on the Phoenix King's neck in a fatal blow. The High King would pluck the Phoenix crown from Calador's head and claiming it as recompense for all the Karaz Ankor had endured in the centuries of war. He turned to the stunned elves and gave one last proclamation. "Go to your ships, Elgi. Leave the old world. There is no place for you here. There ne'er was." The High King was true to his word, and the Azur were allowed to evacuate what remained of Torilesi under guard. While some urged a counter-assault to try to reclaim the Phoenix Crown, Prince Thoriol resisted until word came from Caradril of the invading forces from Nagaroth. The fortress of Anlok had been razed by the Druki once more, and Malekith's troops had landed on the Blighted Isle. There was no denying the threat to Ulthuan their benighted kin now posed. Prince Thoriol would choose then to relinquish any claim of his bloodline to the Phoenix Crown, and instead say he would advise the Council of Princes that Caladriel should be the next to rule the Azur and unite them for the challenges to come. The Dawi had won the War of Vengeance, but it had changed them. The centuries of warfare and hatred had left them even more dour and unforgiving. The Slayer cult that had grown up was emblematic of what the dwarves had now become, more obsessed with atoning for their mistakes than recognizing and fixing them. Through the actions of Malekith, Nagash, Calador, and even Gotrek, the 3 most powerful civilizations in the old world had been decimated in a few short centuries. In victory and in defeat, the kingdoms left behind would remain a pale shadow of their former glory. Soon a new threat would rise to challenge the weakened ancient races and stake their claim for dominance. I hope you've enjoyed our journey together today, and I've earned your subscription, and I'll see you again in the near future, where there is only war.